The boardroom was still as Andrew McAllister stood at the head of the table, his hands gripping the edge, eyes scanning the faces of his top executives. His mind was racing, but outwardly he remained calm. The press conference was scheduled for this afternoon, and the information would hit the public soon. His team was behind on their projections, the stock was plummeting, and the media was already circling. A single press release, an accusation of corporate misconduct, was all it took to send the company into chaos. For years, Andrew had built this empire on his ambition, his ruthless drive to succeed, but today everything hung by a thread. His CFO, Maggie Turner, had warned him, but he hadn't listened. The lawyers were already assembling, the investors were breathing down his neck, and his reputation was on the verge of collapse. The phone in front of him buzzed, an urgent message flashing across the screen. He opened it. "The board is demanding answers now. We need you in the conference room." His heart raced, but his face remained stoic. He wasn't going to let anyone see the cracks. Not yet. The room felt smaller now. Every decision, every betrayal in his rise to power led to this moment. A single misstep could topple it all. The door opened, and his assistant stepped in, eyes wide with apprehension. "Mr. McAllister, it's time," she said quietly. As he stood up and walked toward the conference room, the weight of the world seemed. As the door closed behind him, Andrew took his seat at the head of the table. The room fell silent. Every pair of eyes was on him, waiting for him to speak. His mind raced, but his voice was steady as he began. "We've been through worse," he said, his tone commanding. "We've faced adversity before, and we'll rise again." But deep down, Andrew knew this was different. The weight of the scandal hung heavy in the air, suffocating every word he spoke. His empire was crumbling, and no amount of confidence could change that. The press had already caught wind of the investigation into his company's finances, and the board was demanding answers. Maggie Turner, his CFO, sat across from him, her eyes narrowed in concern. She had been with him since the early days, but even she was unsure of how to weather this storm. "Andrew, this isn't just another setback," Maggie said, her voice calm but laced with fear. "We need to act fast, or we risk losing everything." Andrew turned to face her, the pressure mounting in his chest. The meeting stretched on, the pressure suffocating. Andrew could feel the sweat forming at the back of his neck, but he kept his composure, forcing his thoughts to stay clear. He needed a plan, but every option felt like a losing one. He glanced around the room at the faces of his trusted colleagues. David Mitchell, his loyal right-hand man, sat beside Maggie Turner, both looking at him with concern. The board was demanding answers, but the truth was, no matter what he said, nothing could change the storm that was already brewing. Catherine Delaney, his greatest rival, was already positioning herself to take advantage of the situation. She had the public on her side, and she was slowly chipping away at Andrew's reputation. He could almost hear her voice in his mind, her words cutting through the tension in the room. "You're done, Andrew. You just don't know it yet." He had underestimated her, and now it was too late. But Andrew wasn't going to go down without a fight. The room was full of whispers, but the meeting adjourned, but Andrew couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As the executives filed out of the room, he stayed behind, staring out the window at the city below. His empire, the one he had worked so hard to build, was crumbling before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Maggie Turner lingered by the door, hesitating. "Andrew, we need to act fast," she said, her voice low, almost pleading. "This isn't just about the board or Catherine. It's about the company's future. If we don't make some major moves, we'll lose everything." Andrew turned to face her, his jaw clenched. "I know," he replied, his voice cold. "But the truth is, Maggie, I can't trust anyone anymore. They're all turning on me, even you." He saw the hurt flash across her face, but he quickly masked it. The realization hit him hard. He was alone. His grip on the company was slipping, and it felt like the world was closing in. "I'll fix this," he said, though even he didn't believe the words. Maggie's eyes. The next day, Andrew stood in his office, staring at the stock numbers flashing across the screen. His phone buzzed again with an incoming call from Catherine Delaney. He didn't pick up. The last thing he wanted was to hear her gloat. But the message she left was clear. "You've lost, Andrew. It's only a matter of time before I take everything." The call ended, and Andrew felt the weight of her words settle deep in his chest. He had always seen Catherine as a rival, but this was a personal attack. He had underestimated her ambition, and now she was circling his empire like a vulture. As he sat back in his chair, Andrew finally allowed himself to feel the pressure. The walls were closing in, and no one, not even his most loyal allies, could save him now. He reached for his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. Victor Price, the former CEO who had once mentored him. The line rang, and when Victor picked up, Andrew's voice was steady but filled with hidden desperation. "I need your help, Anne." Andrew McAllister walked into his mansion late that night, the weight of the day's events still hanging over him. His mind replayed every conversation, every betrayal, the look in Maggie Turner's eyes when she had confronted him. Even his wife, Rebecca McAllister, had started pulling away. She had always been the steady presence in his life, the one person he could rely on when the world seemed to be crumbling around him. But now, there was distance in her gaze, a quiet worry that had turned into unspoken resentment. He glanced at the grand staircase, the echoes of laughter from their past seeming to fade into the walls. Rebecca was sitting in the living room, her legs curled beneath her as she stared at her phone, her face unreadable. "Rebecca," Andrew said softly, walking toward her. She looked up, and for a brief moment, their eyes met with familiarity. But the moment passed, and she returned her gaze to the screen. "We need to talk," Andrew began, his voice tight. "About everything." There was a long, "Do you even hear me anymore?" Rebecca McAllister asked, her voice quivering with frustration. Andrew stared at her for a moment, his mind racing. He had been so consumed by his ambition and the fight to retain control of his company that he had neglected everything that truly mattered. "I'm trying," Andrew replied, his voice breaking slightly. "I'm doing everything I can to fix this." But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they rang hollow. He wasn't just trying to fix his company, he was trying to fix everything he had broken, including his marriage. Rebecca put her phone down and stood up, her gaze softening for just a moment. "I'm not asking for your business to be perfect, Andrew," she said quietly. "I'm asking for you. For us." Her words hit him harder than any business setback, and for the first time, Andrew saw just how much he had taken her for granted. The empire he had built, the revenge he had sought, none of it had any meaning if he lost her. "I don't know if I can fix it all," Andrew admitted. The following morning, Andrew met with his former mentor, Victor Price, at a quiet cafe. The elderly man had always been a steady influence in his life, a reminder of the values he had once held dear before his thirst for power overtook him. They sat across from each other, the silence heavy between them. Victor took a sip from his coffee before speaking. "You've lost more than just control of your company, Andrew. You've lost yourself." The words struck him hard, but Victor's gaze was unwavering. "I warned you about this. Power doesn't just corrupt, it isolates. And now you're left with nothing." Andrew felt the sting of truth in Victor's words. He had built an empire, but at what cost? His family, his friends, his morals, all sacrificed in the name of ambition. Victor sighed and leaned forward, his eyes softening. "It's not too late to change, but you need to look inward, not at the boardroom. You need to fix what's broken in here," he said, tapping his chest. The silence stretched on as Andrew pondered Victor's words. Could he still change, or had he already gone too far? Later that afternoon, Maggie Turner visited Andrew's office, her face serious as she sat across from him. "You need to take immediate action, Andrew," she said. "The company is losing faith in you. We can't wait any longer. Catherine Delaney is moving fast, and if we don't do something now, we'll be out of the game completely." Andrew ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling to the surface. Maggie was right. Catherine had been playing the long game, waiting for Andrew to falter so she could strike. But there was something else, something Andrew couldn't ignore. The internal battle between his pride and the reality of the situation. His ego had gotten him this far, but it was now his greatest weakness. "I won't let her take this from me," Andrew said through gritted teeth. Maggie studied him, her expression unreadable. "You'll need more than just determination, Andrew. You need to trust the people who still believe in you." As she stood to leave, Andrew was left alone with his thoughts, the pressure of the situation becoming unbearable. Was he capable of trusting again? That evening, as Andrew sat in his study, he couldn't escape the mounting pressure. His phone buzzed again. Another text from Rebecca McAllister. "We need to talk." The words felt like a weight in his chest, but he couldn't ignore them. He had been so consumed with everything else, his company, his reputation, that he had neglected the one person who had always been there for him. The thought of losing Rebecca for good brought a sharp sting of panic. He put the phone down and stood up, pacing. This wasn't just about the company anymore. This was about his future, his family, and everything he had almost destroyed. With a sigh, he picked up his phone and dialed her number. It was time to face the damage he had caused, both in the boardroom and at home. Andrew McAllister knew the walls were closing in, but nothing prepared him for the betrayal that came next. Late one evening, as he reviewed financial reports in his office, his assistant, Lily Evans, walked in with an urgent message. Catherine Delaney's team just filed for a hostile takeover. They're mobilizing investors. Andrew felt his blood run cold. Catherine had always been a fierce competitor, but this was different. This was personal. He had known her for years, but now, with his company faltering, she was moving in for the kill. The realization hit him hard. It wasn't just business anymore. It was revenge. His mind raced. David Mitchell, his right-hand man, had always promised loyalty. Maggie Turner, his CFO, had warned him of the risks. But this was the culmination of his arrogance. He had made too many enemies, and now they were circling like vultures. He couldn't let her take what was his. The next steps would define everything. The game was on. As the news of Catherine's takeover attempt spread, Andrew called an emergency meeting with Maggie Turner and David Mitchell in the boardroom. The air was thick with tension as Andrew stood at the head of the table. "We can't let this happen," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the uneasy silence. "Catherine is making her move, and if we don't act now, we lose everything." David sat back in his chair, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. "It's going to be hard," he said, his voice low. "Her team has already secured a lot of funding. We might not have the leverage we need to fight back." Andrew slammed his fist on the table, his frustration evident. "I don't care how hard it is. We've been through worse, and I'll be damned if I let her take what's mine." Maggie nodded, her expression serious. "We need to get ahead of this, but we can't let our emotions cloud our judgment. We need a strategy, not a fight to the death." Andrew glared at her but knew she was right. But the thought of losing everything. That night after the board meeting, Andrew took to his office alone. He wasn't sure what was worse, the idea of losing his empire or the realization that he had no one to trust anymore. He thought about Maggie Turner and David Mitchell, the people who had been with him from the start. But could they be trusted? Or were they just waiting for him to fall so they could take what they wanted? His mind raced with suspicion, but he quickly shoved those thoughts aside. He couldn't afford to doubt them now, not when the stakes were so high. He glanced at the pile of paperwork on his desk, the plans, the financials, the battle he was about to fight. The walls were closing in, but he wasn't ready to give up just yet. Andrew leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. The weight of the decisions ahead threatened to crush him, but he refused to let it break him. The game wasn't over. Not yet. He would do whatever it took to survive, even if it meant sacrificing everything. The following day, Catherine Delaney made her move. She publicly announced her bid to take over Andrew's company, securing a group of powerful investors to back her. The press was already on it. Headlines splashed across every major outlet. Andrew McAllister's empire in crisis. Catherine Delaney moves to take over McAllister Enterprises. Andrew watched as the news broke, his heart sinking. The world was watching, and every move he made now was under scrutiny. Maggie Turner entered his office, holding a newspaper with the headline staring back at him. "She's playing dirty," Andrew muttered, his fist clenched. Maggie sat down across from him, her face grim. "This isn't just a business move anymore, Andrew. She's out for revenge. You've made a lot of enemies over the years." Andrew slammed his fist on the desk, frustration boiling over. "I won't let her win. I'll take her down first. I'll make sure of it." He knew he was running out of time, but he wasn't going to let Catherine Delaney walk all over him. That night, as Andrew sat alone in his office, he heard a knock on the door. David Mitchell entered, his face unreadable. Andrew looked up at him, suspicion creeping in. "What's the word on the takeover?" Andrew asked. David hesitated for a moment before responding. "We've lost some key investors, but we still have a chance. But we'll need to act quickly." Andrew studied him carefully, his instincts telling him to be wary. "You sure we're still in this together?" David met his gaze, his expression tight. "We are. But you're going to have to trust me, Andrew. We have to move fast or it's over." For the first time, Andrew felt a flicker of doubt. Could he trust David Mitchell? Or was David just another ally ready to turn on him? The tension between them was palpable, but Andrew pushed the thought aside. He couldn't afford to let doubt weaken him now. Andrew had spent the last few days working tirelessly to regain control of his company. But just as things seemed to be falling into place, he received an unexpected call. The voice on the other end was familiar, but the words were a shock. "Andrew, we need to talk. I think you deserve to know the truth." It was Rebecca, his wife. His heart sank. "What's going on, Rebecca?" he asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "It's not what you think," she said. "I've kept something from you. Something that changes everything." His mind raced as the weight of her words settled. What could be so significant that it would unravel everything he had worked for? The silence stretched between them, and Andrew felt the ground beneath him start to shift. As Rebecca spoke, Andrew's world seemed to shatter around him. She revealed that she had known about a secret plot within the company for months, one that involved his most trusted advisor, David. He could hardly believe it. The betrayal cut deep. "David has been working with Catherine all along," Rebecca confessed. "He's been feeding her information, undermining you from the inside. He's been orchestrating everything behind your back." Andrew's heart pounded in his chest. This was more than just a corporate battle. It was personal. David had been his closest ally, and to hear that he had been manipulating him all along was like a punch to the gut. The truth hit Andrew like a wave, leaving him gasping for air. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked, the hurt evident in his voice. Rebecca's voice trembled. "I didn't want to believe it. But now, you need to know. The situation is worse than you think." Andrew stood frozen, unable to process what he had just learned. Andrew's mind raced as he processed the revelation. David had always been loyal, hadn't he? They had built the company together, shared countless hours of hard work and sacrifice. But now, it all seemed like a lie. Andrew quickly called David into his office, his heart pounding. When David arrived, his usual confident demeanor had faltered. There was no bravado, no smirk, just cold calculation. "What's going on, David?" Andrew's voice was tight with barely contained rage. David didn't immediately respond, but the silence was enough. "I know," Andrew finally said, his voice steely. "I know you've been working with Catherine. It ends now." David's face hardened, but his eyes betrayed the truth. "I was trying to save you from yourself, Andrew," David said, his voice low and measured. "You've been blind to everything around you. Catherine isn't your enemy. I am." The words hung in the air, a brutal confession that left Andrew reeling. He had trusted David with everything, and now it seemed David was the one who aged. As the conversation with David continued, Andrew realized the full scope of the betrayal. It wasn't just about business, It was about control, power, and revenge. David had been waiting for the right moment to strike, carefully setting everything in motion. Andrew had been so focused on defeating Catherine, he had overlooked the traitor in his midst. "You were always in the background, David," Andrew said, his voice low. "I never saw you coming." David didn't flinch. "I didn't want you to," he replied. "You were too busy focusing on Catherine and your empire to see the real enemy." The words cut deeper than anything Andrew had felt in years. He was no longer in control. His empire was crumbling, and the people he had trusted were turning against him. But the worst part was knowing that in the end, it wasn't Catherine who had brought him down, it was David. The revelation was a turning point for Andrew. He had lost everything: his company, his reputation, his closest ally. But the realization of how far David had gone fueled something in Andrew. The anger, the betrayal, the fear, it all merged into a singular purpose. Andrew turned to face David one last time. "You may have won the battle, David, but I will make sure you regret it. You'll never take what's mine without a price." David's smirk only deepened. "You're too late, Andrew," he said, standing up. "The game is over. You lost." But Andrew wasn't ready to surrender just yet. He had built this empire on his terms, and he wasn't going to let it be destroyed by a traitor. The final confrontation was just beginning. Andrew's pride, his ambition, it would either be his salvation or his downfall. But he would go down fighting. The days following the confrontation with David felt like a blur. Andrew had finally accepted that his world was slipping away, but he couldn't stop fighting. He met with his remaining allies, Maggie and Victor, who had been out of the corporate scene for years. "It's all or nothing now," Andrew said, his voice sharp with determination. "If we don't act fast, it's over. Catherine's takeover is imminent, and I've already lost too much." Maggie looked at him, her brow furrowed with concern. "We're running out of time, Andrew. But if we strike now, we can still control the board's vote. We just need to get the key investors on our side." Victor leaned forward, his voice calm yet filled with experience. "This isn't about just saving your company anymore, Andrew. It's about your legacy. You've burned a lot of bridges to get here. Do you really want to destroy everything for the sake of a final fight?" Andrew didn't respond immediately, the weight of his past decisions settling over him. But he knew there was no tea. The final battle was set to take place in the boardroom. Andrew, armed with his last-ditch efforts, prepared to make his move. He had secured the investors and was ready to confront Catherine directly. As the meeting began, the tension in the room was palpable. The board was split, with some siding with Andrew, while others had already been swayed by Catherine's promises of a brighter future. The air was thick with uncertainty as Andrew stood, his heart pounding in his chest. "I've spent years building this company. It's not just a business, it's my life," Andrew began, his voice filled with conviction. "Catherine may offer something new, but her way will destroy everything we've worked for. She's not here to save the company, she's here to take it for herself. I won't let that happen." Catherine, sitting across the table, raised an eyebrow. "I'm not here to destroy anything, Andrew. I'm here to take what's rightfully mine," she said coolly. Her calm demeanor only fueled Andrew's anger. "Your empire is all red." As the vote began, Andrew's heart raced. He watched as the members of the board cast their ballots, each one a nail in his coffin or a possible lifeline. Maggie stood by his side, her face tense but composed. The minutes dragged on, each passing second filled with the uncertainty of whether he had done enough to win back control. But then, the unexpected happened. David, his former ally, entered the room. He walked past Andrew without a word, his eyes meeting Andrew's for a fleeting moment. "Oh, what is he doing here?" Andrew muttered under his breath, his mind racing. David didn't immediately respond, but the silence was enough. "I know," Andrew finally said, his voice steely. "I know you've been working with Catherine. It ends now." David's face hardened, but his eyes betrayed the truth. "I was trying to save you from yourself, Andrew," David said, his voice low and measured. "You've been blind to everything around you. Catherine isn't your enemy. I am." The words hung in the air, a brutal confession that left. As the conversation with David continued, Andrew realized the full scope of the betrayal. It wasn't just about business. It was about control, power, and revenge. David had been waiting for the right moment to strike, carefully setting everything in motion. Andrew had been so focused on defeating Catherine, he had overlooked the traitor in his midst. "You were always in the background, David," Andrew said, his voice low. "I never saw you coming." David didn't flinch. "I didn't want you to," he replied. "You were too busy focusing on Catherine and your empire to see the real enemy." The words cut deeper than anything Andrew had felt in years. He was no longer in control. His empire was crumbling, and the people he had trusted were turning against him. But the worst part was knowing that, in the end, it wasn't Catherine who had brought him down, it was David. The revelation was a turning point for Andrew. He had lost everything: his company, his reputation, his closest ally. But the realization of how far David had gone fueled something in Andrew. The anger, the betrayal, the fear, it all merged into a singular purpose. Andrew turned to face David one last time. "You may have won the battle, David, but I will make sure you regret it. You'll never take what's mine without a price." David's smirk only deepened. "You're too late, Andrew," he said, standing up. "The game is over. You lost." But Andrew wasn't ready to surrender just yet. He had built this empire on his terms, and he wasn't going to let it be destroyed by a traitor. The final confrontation was just beginning. Andrew's pride, his ambition, it would either be his salvation or his downfall. But he would go down fighting. Andrew sat in his office the day after the board's final decision. His empire was no longer his own. Catherine had won. He had fought to the bitter end, but in the end, it wasn't enough. The weight of defeat settled in his chest like an anchor. He had lost everything he had worked for, and it was his pride, his refusal to trust others, that had led to his downfall. The phone on his desk buzzed, another message from Rebecca. He hadn't seen her since the board meeting, and even though the text was brief, he could feel the distance between them growing. "We need to talk." He stared at the words, guilt seeping in. He knew he had failed her, just like he had failed himself. The years of ambition, the deals, the sacrifices, it had all been for nothing. The next day, Andrew walked into his home, each step heavier than the last. The house was still, too still, as if even the walls knew something was broken. Rebecca sat in the living room, her back turned, staring out the window. When she heard him enter, she didn't turn around. "I know," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "I know you did everything you could, but it's too late now. You've destroyed everything, Andrew. Not just the company, but us." Her words hit him harder than anything he had ever faced. It wasn't the fall of the company that hurt the most. It was the fall of his family. He had been so focused on power that he hadn't seen the one thing he had lost in the process. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I never meant for it to end this way." But the words felt empty. He had failed her, just like he had failed himself. Rebecca didn't respond. Instead, she stood up, walking toward the bedroom. "You need to decide what's more important, your pride or your family." Then. That night, Andrew stood by the window of his office, staring out at the city that seemed so far away now. He could see the lights twinkling in the distance, the world moving forward without him. He thought of the decisions he had made, the lies he had told, and the bridges he had burned. He had built an empire, but it had come at a price, one he wasn't sure he could pay. He wasn't ready to give up completely, but he knew things couldn't go back to the way they were. The company was lost, Catherine had taken control, and he had no choice but to accept that. But there was still something he could do. He still had a chance to rebuild himself, even if it meant starting from scratch. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, Andrew understood that redemption wouldn't come from business or power. It would come from within. In the following weeks, Andrew made a choice. He couldn't undo the damage he had caused, but he could start anew. He reached out to Maggie and Victor once again, asking for guidance on what to do next. "I've been to the top, And I've seen the cost of getting there, Andrew admitted. I don't want to keep chasing power. I want to rebuild, but I don't know how. Maggie looked at him, her expression a mixture of sympathy and understanding. You can start by being honest with yourself. You've got to deal with what you've lost before you can move forward. Victor nodded, his voice softer than it had been before. And you've got to rebuild the trust you lost, not just in others, but in yourself. The words hit Andrew hard. He had focused so much on power that he had neglected the one thing that truly mattered: integrity. Now, it was time to regain that, no matter how difficult it might be. A few months passed, and Andrew worked tirelessly to rebuild his life. He started small, taking on consulting work for smaller companies, and slowly gaining back the trust of his peers. There were setbacks, but each failure taught him something valuable. As he walked through the city one morning, he realized something. He had lost everything once, but he had learned from it. His pride had led to his downfall, but his humility would lead him back. He had found redemption, not in his wealth or power, but in the simple act of starting over. He wasn't the same person he had been before. He had learned that success wasn't measured by the size of his empire, but by the relationships he built and the integrity he kept. And for the first time in years, Andrew felt like he was on the right path. Andrew stood outside his former company's headquarters. The building, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a distant memory. Catherine had taken control, and he had lost everything. The city's skyline loomed before him, a reminder of the empire he had once ruled. His mind replayed the events that had led to this moment, the betrayals, the mistakes, the sacrifices. He had built his empire on pride, but now he was left with only the remnants of it. Yet, despite everything, there was a sense of calm within him. The chaos of the past few months had forced him to confront who he was and what he had become. He wasn't the man he used to be, the ruthless, power-hungry CEO, the man who had sacrificed everything for success. He was someone else now, someone who had learned from his mistakes. And while he had lost his empire, he had gained something far more valuable: self-awareness. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, he was willing to face it. Andrew received a call from Maggie that evening. She had been one of the few people who had stayed by his side through everything. "I heard what happened," she said softly, "but I want you to know, Andrew, you're not the man you were before. You've changed, for the better." Her words were a balm to the wounds he hadn't realized were still fresh. For a moment he allowed himself to feel something other than regret. He had lost his company, but he had gained perspective. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what comes next, but I'm going to keep trying. I'm going to rebuild not just my career, but everything I've lost." Maggie's voice softened. "I believe in you." Andrew looked out the window, the city lights twinkling in the distance. He had made mistakes, but he still had the ability to change, to fight for a future that was built on integrity, not power. The following day, Andrew decided to leave the city. He had spent his entire life chasing success in the corporate world, but now, he felt it was time to step away. As he packed his things, he thought about the people he had left behind, his family, his colleagues, and the company that had been his life. It wasn't the end he had imagined, but it was the end he needed. He wasn't running away, he was moving forward. The road to redemption would be long, but it was a journey he had to take alone. When he stepped out of the apartment, the cool air greeted him, a sign that a new chapter had begun. He wasn't sure where it would lead, but for the first time in years, he felt a sense of freedom. Weeks passed and Andrew found himself in a quiet town, far from the chaos of the city. He rented a small house and began working with local businesses, offering advice to those who needed it. For the first time, he wasn't driven by power or profit. He was driven by a desire to help. The work was simple, but it was fulfilling in a way his former life had never been. One evening, he received a message from Rebecca. "I've been thinking a lot. Maybe it's time for us to talk. I don't know what the future holds, but I'm willing to start over." The message hit him hard. It wasn't an apology, but it was a step. And for the first time, Andrew felt hope. Not because he had everything figured out, but because he was willing to try again. The final scene takes place at a small cafe, where Andrew meets with Rebecca. They sit across from each other, the silence between them heavy but not uncomfortable. "I'm sorry for everything," Andrew says, his voice sincere. "I should have never let it get this far." Rebecca looks at him, her expression softening. "We both made mistakes," she replies. "But maybe we can still fix things. Maybe we can start fresh." Andrew smiles faintly. "I'd like that." The camera lingers on their hands, as they both reach for their coffee cups. It's a small gesture, but it signifies a new beginning, a chance to rebuild, to heal, and to move forward together.